The former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt was called to give evidence. Now, he was in post from 2012 to 2018 when Lucy Letby was working. He started his evidence to the inquiry by apologising to the families of the babies killed and harmed, and he told them he took ultimate responsibility because what happened at the Countess of Chester Hospital happened on his watch.
I think it's probably appropriate that I should open my comments by saying to the families associated with this terrible tragedy that it happened on my watch as Health Secretary, and that although you don't bear direct personal responsibility for everything that happens in every ward in the NHS, you do have ultimate responsibility for the NHS, and insofar as lessons were not learned from previous inquiries that could have been, or the right systems were not in place that could have prevented this appalling tragedy, then I do bear ultimate responsibility, and I want to put on record my apology to the families for anything that didn't happen that could potentially have prevented such an appalling crime.
And that really became a bit of a theme of his evidence, that very, very few recommendations from previous inquiries have been implemented. Now, specifically, Mr. Hunt talked about the introduction of medical examiners, which he said was a recommendation first mooted after the inquiry into Harold Shipman's crimes back in 2004. But he admitted it wasn't until more than 20 years later when it was finally put in place. This is last year, because it was too costly and because there was a shortage of doctors in the NHS, and the priority was for them to treat patients instead. And he admitted to Rachel Langdale, the barrister for the inquiry, that if a medical examiner had been in place at the Countess, then Lucy Letby may have been caught sooner.
Do you see, looking back, the significance of that recommendation and how that may have made a difference in a case such as the one this inquiry is examining?
I think so. I think of all the things that could have potentially meant that what happened at the Countess of Chester was spotted earlier and the dots were joined up, would have been having medical examiners. I think that it is something that I look at as being one of the things that we took too long to implement.
Now, Mr. Hunt said he finally found the money for medical examiners to be introduced into the NHS in 2023, not when he was the Health Secretary, but in fact when he was the Chancellor.
So I wanted medical examiners to happen because I wanted the NHS to have a better learning culture and better processes in place to learn from medical error. But I recognise that there is a big read across to deliberate harm done by the Shipmans, the Letbys, whoever.
He also called for recommendations from inquiries to be prioritised using a traffic light system, he suggested, so that it was clear which ones were urgent safety measures and needed to be implemented within weeks to protect patients across the whole of the NHS. And he also said recommendations needed to be more specific. He said, for example, it was no good sending a round robin email to all staff about raising awareness of the possibility of malicious harm, because it would end up as a tick box exercise. He said they needed to be better translated so that they had an impact on the ground. He also said NHS managers were constantly being bombarded by recommendations from a range of organisations, and there was no clear system or body that monitored ones that were implemented and ones that weren't. He said this was a huge gap to fill. And he said frequent cabinet reshuffles were unhelpful because it meant recommendations were too often kicked into the long grass.
Finally, he did say the NHS was too target driven. In fact, he called it target mad. And he said this had created a blame culture where there was a lack of transparency in admitting genuine errors made by well-meaning doctors and nurses. And what this meant is it was harder to spot and root out the rare occasions when what he called malign actors like the Shipmans, the Allets and the Letbys were causing deliberate harm. And he said getting rid of some of those targets would mean the NHS would be more patient-focused. And in fact, he said he regretted not dismantling more of those targets when he was Health Secretary.